I've been very obsessed with far-flung, remote British islands. I've investigated them in the past. I'm investigating one at the moment. But as I've been trying to avoid deadlines, I have been lost in reading about a completely different British island and what it would take someone born and raised on one of these very remote places to leave, for everyone to leave. I'm calling this story Shoot the Dogs.
Oh my God. As a dog lover, I'm very concerned, but I'm excited. And I'm broadcasting with you live from Los Angeles.
You're bi-coastal.
I'm bi-coastal, bisexual. What next? But I've been in Hungary at a wonderful wedding. And then I came to Los Angeles to work on a true crime story, which I will hopefully be able to talk about a little bit more in coming months.
I know one sentence about that story, and that has me salivating, but I won't spoil it now.
Thank you so much. I'm under NDA, so.
Well, and when you were in Hungary, what was the best thing you ate?
I have to say it was the wedding food itself, because it was like under festoon lighting and then like a really delicious pork scenario and some salmon, and just like it was really, really yummy. I have to say Eastern Europe is not known for its famous cuisine. And when I was roaming around Budapest, I had some mishaps, but I would say the wedding made up for that. What about you? Have you been jet setting?
No, I've been chained to my desk on deadline, so I've been living a sort of sad office-based existence. But I have been doing lots of interesting reading as I've been trying to avoid said deadlines. And I thought of you the other day when I was reading one part of a news website, and it was saying that your exact haircut, how would you describe it, is bang on trend at the moment. Yeah. Bang on trend. It was saying we should all be getting it.
It's true. I used to get Botox in my forehead, but then when I learned that I could just have a fringe, or what Americans call bangs, I didn't need it anymore. But also...
Really? I didn't know this.
I don't know why I'm being so confessional.
Don't get surgery. Get a new haircut.
I mean, and also what I read the other day was that if you want to be cheekbone forward, that this is the haircut. So it kind of elevates it. I don't understand the science.
And for audio listeners, it's sort of very long, wavy hair you've got, a fringe, and sort of
shaggy.
Chunky at the top. Shaggy is the word.
It's shaggy. It's kind of 70s rocker a little bit, like short on the top and long at the bottom. So it can look ratty if it's not been well kempt, I will say.
Fascinating about the Botox. I guess if you don't want a facelift, just sort of grow it all down like Cousin It. And just...
It's certainly cheaper. And you know what? I was skeptical of the... I don't want to keep putting chemicals in my face. So, you know.
That is a good position to hold.
On that note, please tell me that this story doesn't end in the death of dogs. I'm very concerned.
It does, I'm afraid, but it's not the main thrust of it. This is about Tristan da Cunha, and British listeners might know about Tristan da Cunha at the moment because we've had this whole news story a few months ago about this ship where there was hantavirus, this quite sort of worrying bug that was on a cruise ship that was going up through the Atlantic, and like some passengers got off on Tristan da Cunha, and they had to send Royal Navy paratroopers in to go and drop them medics and things. So anyway, people might be aware of Tristan da Cunha, but it is in the middle of the South Atlantic. At the bottom, it is a British island. 250 people live there right now. And if you imagine like a classic volcano island, remember the Pixar short Lava?
Yeah.
Looks like that.
Oh.
Just like, a volcano.
And why? What was like the industry? Like, what would those 250 people do?
So people ended up there. Well, it was first discovered by Portuguese, a guy called Tristan da Cunha, who named it after himself, but he couldn't actually get on land. The Americans tried to get on as well. A guy called Jonathan Lambert from Salem, Massachusetts, famous for other things, landed there with a couple of friends and tried to make himself sovereign, but that didn't work. He actually drowned. It was only in 1816 that the British stationed a military garrison there because they had Napoleon on St. Helena, which is very far to the north. And their idea was, well, let's put some troops on there in case the French come. We've got backup. So that's how people ended there.
This is amazing. I mean, the fact that no one could really get on there until that late is sort of like very mystical. And then the people there are really coming from a military origin, basically, just literally there to guard against Napoleon, but then people stayed.
Exactly. It was a guy called Glass who, when they said, okay, we don't actually need a military garrison here anymore, he's like, well, I might stay actually with my wife, and some other people stayed, and this community started there. And
is it warm? Is it beachy? Apart from having volcanoes, is it?
It's not beachy. It is, I think it is technically classed as subtropical. It's not sort of the Maldives, but it is very, very remote. There's no airstrip like on St. Helena, a bit like Pitcairn. It's a case of getting on a passing ship. But it is a voyage of 6 or 7 days from Cape Town, and there's only a handful of sailings a year that stop there. This, though, is a story about what happened there in 1961, because back then, life was simple. They didn't have lots of technology or anything, but it was good. It felt like Tristan da Cunha was in a good place. They had cash on the island. They had regular wages for the first time. There was a doctor. There was a nurse. There was an island administrator. People who used to clean their teeth with rags all of a sudden had toothbrushes. And they were proudly British as well, because it is a British overseas territory. The people who lived there are British citizens. In 1957, Prince Philip visited, and one book I read described every cottage garden on the island being stripped of its roses, daisies, and marigolds to create this sort of floral welcome arch for him. So,
oh my goodness,
they're big into their British heritage.
I bet they made a lovely Sunday roast. I bet Yorkshires were always a possible.
Although the sort of main food, their sort of main economy is crawfish. Is Tristan lobster. So maybe something snazzy with that.
Yeah, I do love lobster.
But in 1961, in October, people started to feel a literal shift in how things were on the island. One resident wrote to a friend in England talking of a shaking that had been going on since August. Concerning if you live on a volcano, there's one settlement on Tristan called Edinburgh of the Seven Seas, and it's basically where everybody lives. And if you imagine the profile of an island that is basically a volcano, it's just on the very edge, where it's sort of flat enough to build. But the volcano is really old. It was formed, hold the line, caller, 65 to 1.8 million years ago. So it's unlikely to reawaken.
That makes it inactive, does it? Because old to me doesn't necessarily mean not ferocious or not possible to erupt, but
it's worrying if you live on an island which is basically just a volcano, and all of a sudden you start to feel shaking, and it got worse and worse and worse. On the 17th of September they had their most severe earthquake so far, and imagine how atmospheric is this. It was evensong at their church, and there was a landslide on the cliffs behind the crawfish processing factory next to the main settlement. And the island administrator Peter Wheeler wrote later, suddenly walls heaved in, the floor trembled, and for a sickening second, the roof threatened to crash in.
I would have to say there would be a poppy-shaped hole in that evening song atmosphere, and I would be on a canoe heading towards anywhere out of there. There is no way I'm hanging around to see how this pans out.
Well, Peter could clearly tell how it was going, because he said, in that moment, I felt the first intimation of disaster. Now, in October, there is now a general belief that what is happening is volcanic in nature, Peter wrote a little bit later on. And all the tremors seem to be particularly concentrated around the settlement where everyone was living. It got to the point where people who were working in the factory, which was to the side of the settlement, actually had someone on lookout for rock falls caused by the various tremors. They could blow a whistle, and so people could get out of the way. So it's really starting to impact on daily life. Yeah. Little did they know at this point.
There?
If you imagine the volcano, a bit kind of cone like this, and the settlement is on the edge, by this point in October, the magma rising up through the volcano is already higher than the settlement.
Oh my God.
And is growing.
So aren't they extremely hot as well? Was the ground hot?
That's a very good question. I don't know, actually. Yeah, would you start to have steam just randomly come out of the ground?
Yeah, suddenly frying an egg on your front porch.
The main thing that people noticed in sort of early October was sort of cottages slightly moving, doors and windows getting stuck because, the ground underneath you is sort of adjusting. But it got so bad that one night, just everyone decided to get out of Dodge. In a book called Angry Island, which Margaret McKay wrote, which I was reading, she said, quote, it was a kind of telepathic mass movement. No order had been given, no word passed down. She said it was like small flocks of migrating night birds. The families from the east side of the settlement carried their babies and their bundles towards the west. It was an eerie, fateful, quiet procession.
Oh my God.
Problem is, though, is there isn't much else. So if you leave your home and move east, you're having to sort of stay somewhere else. So where would you go? All of this is happening. The magma is rising in the volcano. You're moving away from the settlement. There's nowhere really to stay. What is going to happen? We'll be back in a moment.
So what is the nearest landmass that they could get to? Because I suppose I would be thinking, I'm moving from east to west, and I want there to be little escape dinghies like off the Titanic, or something. I mean,
or not off the Titanic, off a better boat.
Yeah, of one that managed to succeed. Where could they get to, if anywhere?
The nearest island was an island called Inaccessible.
Okay. How far away was that?
You could get there on a boat. I mean, you couldn't swim there. Okay. You wouldn't be able to canoe there. When you look at a Google Maps, it seems relatively close. But there is a second closest island called Nightingale, which they would sometimes go across to on a boat to catch birds and get bird eggs. That seems more promising.
Yeah.
Yes, but they haven't quite got to this point yet. So people are moving east, dragging their suitcases, their bags, and their babies. The priest who was on the island even baptized the child of one anxious mother, so concerned were they about what was going to happen. And the next day, people just didn't turn up for work. And a man who was out on a ship, because they had a ship to help sort of catch the crawfish there, described seeing the cracks growing higher and higher and then falling back again on this enormous bulge that was growing in the side of the volcano right over the settlement. One local was later quoted as saying there was a strange swelling on the slope, rounding into what was a bubble.
Oh my God.
It was at this point when that bubble was growing at 5 feet an hour.
That's like me in a bit. That's crazy. How tall is it overall?
Okay, 6,765 feet.
Okay.
Is the height of the summit of the volcano.
Okay.
So this bulge is getting massive on the side of the island. So they decided, we need to get out of Dodge. So they sent what's called a clear the line Morse code emergency telegram. The guy who was at the station in Cape Town who received this, it's so rare. They'd never received one of these before. They didn't really know what it was. So they've got this boat, which they use to catch crawfish. Another boat, HMS Leopard, sets off from Cape Town to try and help them get off. But until then, they can't. They're just sitting on the edge of the island waiting. And on the 10th of October, the boat that's already there is keeping watch, and they see the eruption start at 2 a.m. They set off warning flares to try and wake the people up who were there, and they send radio signals as well. One islander later recalled, "I shall never forget the sight of our men huddled around our small radio transmitter, talking to the ship and hearing that our volcano was now erupting in earnest. I saw big boulders being thrown out of the volcano. They were shooting out and rolling down the hillside above the settlement road. Red cinders came rolling down after boulders," one person told the Times. They had these longboats, which were in a shelter. So they managed to get onto those, women and children first, and they managed to get off to not just one boat that was out watching, but there was sort of another boat as well that they could all get on.
Brave of the boats, though, because you'd think that some of them would be like, I'm seeing an erupting volcano and there are people trapped there. However,
I'd like to get away. But maybe if you're in a community of 250 people, that's you're very.
But the boat person's not presumably on that community, though, is he? Isn't he?
Yeah, because they're working the boat trying to get the crawfish.
Okay,
exactly.
That makes sense. I thought you meant like someone from out in the ocean. Okay,
out in Cape Town. Oh no. Yeah. But but it's a very egalitarian society. They don't have land ownership there. It's all very, we're here to help and support each other. So they got off onto these boats. They managed to get onto Nightingale, not the closest island, Inaccessible. I actually never found out why Inaccessible is particularly inaccessible, but anyway, it's so inaccessible it's called Inaccessible. And they stayed the night on Nightingale, where people would occasionally go over and hunt birds and collect eggs. And they had little sort of cases that had already been left there for if anyone was going over to that island with like tea, coffee, potatoes, rations.
Oh, it's so
they could
English.
spend the night there. Yeah. So they could. So there was some kind of provisions. Okay. And then this HMS Leopard arrived from Cape Town and took them all off, and they were all soon off to the UK. However, Peter Wheeler, who was the island administrator, and a crack squad returned to the island in the midst of this eruption to try and salvage people's cash, some documents, some hospital equipment, clothing. And they found in some of the homes a teapot with half-drunk cups of tea around it, batches of potatoes that had been half peeled. People had just stopped what they were doing and got off. It's at this point that they kill all the dogs.
Luke, why can't it end there? They all got away with their pets and everything was fine. That's how it ends, right?
No, because they said, well, if we're leaving this island, we've got sheep and we've got cows and we may come back at some point in the future. Let's just shoot the dogs so the sheep are fine. They did actually find that it was quite hard to shoot a dog because once you've shot one of them, the rest of them run away because, you know, they sort of know what's happening. So they managed to shoot most of them.
There?
I don't know the exact number, but I do know that 2 were saved, 2 puppies, and they were taken back to the UK and they were called Tristan and Cunha after the island. Your man Peter finished up there, salvaged what they could, and he managed to get to the UK eventually with everyone as well. And he told the press waiting there that, quote, "The island is dead. It is finished. I don't think anyone will ever want to live there again. The older ones are completely bewildered. The youngsters are anxious to sample the bright lights they've never seen." But he said the success of the evacuation was such that nobody even got wet during the evacuation. That's how good they were at getting people off.
Okay, just pause there. You've got old people who presumably have like basically never or actually never left the island, and they're arriving to the UK where you've got London, Manchester, Liverpool, all these people. You probably would have never been in a crowd larger than 250, so that's completely crazy. Then you've got young people, which when you say who want to experience the bright lights, it makes me think of the Amish in Rumspringa, where they're allowed to go off and, you know, try the delights of life. Like they must have been
they have like a year or something where they can go, or...
Yeah, it would have been like that en masse. Because imagine you'd been like, oh, it's only Steve from up the road and Bob. And now suddenly there's like all these cute guys. You've got drugs, alcohol. I mean, I hope someone's written a memoir. It's so interesting.
Well, there's a book I was reading called The Glass Island, written by Nancy Hosegood. And she said it like this: for the first time in their lives, people who had never used a telephone, ridden in a car, or seen a train, who had never watched television, pressed a light switch, or tasted ice cream, sampled civilized life in Britain. That was the scale of the difference.
Oh my God, that's amazing. That's even more than I thought. So they'd never even... God, they must have been so pure though, so innocent.
Well, and here's the problem. So first, they're taken to a place called Pendle Camp in Surrey. One official described it as an ideal place for refugees. They'll have everything they need. But it's actually just like a large barracks, which was cold. Someone described leaving drinking water next to their bed and it being ice. There's a BBC television appeal which tried to bring in donations of money. There was concerns about disease because, you know, they'd lived on this island, so hadn't had exposure to various strains of cold and flu that were going around, so they had to be inoculated. But also the sort of mental impact of all of this was weighing quite heavily on them. There's a guy called Peter Munch, who was a Norwegian who had been to Tristan da Cunha, I think a couple of times, or at least once, and had written about it, then travelled to the UK to go and see them there. And he said not a day passed in that miserable army camp in Surrey unless somebody, a man or a woman, broke down in tears.
Oh no.
There was
I
talk
was imagining them like sorry to use this reference, but like George in the Jungle, like kind of having a good time, like trying pizza for the first time. But actually it's this miserable prison that's like, and they're away from everything they knew and they've lost their dogs and it's horrible.
Yeah. And they eventually decide to move them to a place called Colshot in Hampshire. There it was a sort of Royal Air Force married quarters settlement, as they called them. And it's a street. You can go there now and it's still called Tristan Close because they moved them all into this sort of Coronation Street style setup. And they thought it'd be perfect. We can keep them all together, so we're not splitting them up. There's a post office, there's a church, there's a little shop. Easy peasy. The Women's Voluntary Service, the WVS, provided flowers for the homes and curtains. They all got given lessons on how to use a gas cooker and basic British electrics. The kids were taken to London on a day trip. At Christmas, they saw the Panto at the Palladium. But when asked about what they enjoyed most by their teacher, they enjoyed the river the most, seeing the Thames, because it reminded them of the ocean, which they grew up next to in the middle of the South Atlantic. Now, you said about the kind of George in the Jungle aspect of this, of just being so innocent when you get to these places. This is one of the problems. There's a story about one woman, Stella Glass, and her mother-in-law. Glass is one of the very popular surnames on the island because the guy who originally stayed there, who was stationed out in the garrison, his surname was Glass. This is a very popular surname on the island. There's a story about her and her mother-in-law who 9 months into living into the UK buy a big sack of potatoes when they're in Southampton and then stop at a clothing store to go and look in there. So they leave the big bag of potatoes by the front door and go in and look at some clothes and come back and the potatoes are gone. Obviously, but not so obvious to them. And there's another guy who was working as a night watchman at a port and he was mugged and someone stole his treasured pocket watch of him. It's just these like petty crimes, completely different atmosphere, quite sort of grimmish living conditions, especially compared to what they had before. So all of them started to think like, we just wish we could go back, but the volcano.
Oh,
so
sorry, you're going to tell me, but I'm presuming someone's tracking whether it went off and like whether it did its thing and they could go back.
Exactly. The Royal Society set out on a kind of mission to go and see what had happened with this volcano. And they reported that aside from the coastline being extended by the lava flow and the factory being completely caked and covered in lava, the main settlement, Edinburgh of the Seven Seas, but for one house, a house owned by a man called Dennis Green, his house had been burned to the ground, everything else was absolutely fine. It had not been touched.
Wow.
So the lava flow had completely missed, but for Dennis Green's house, the main settlement where they all lived. They even reported...
Dennis Green. He must have been like, bloody hell, I'm the unluckiest man on the island.
Well, the odds are 1 in 250.
True, pretty high.
So, they even reported that there was the same number of cows that were there, and they seemed, quote, happy and oblivious to everything, which I guess is the sort of the state of cows. Problem is, though, is they then came back with this report, and they were very worried. Oh, if we tell the islanders this, they're going to be agitating to return. And they said, this expedition was just purely scientific. It's not concerned in any way with questions of possible resettlement. But on that expedition, working as guides, were 2 of the islanders, a guy called Joseph Glass and a guy called Adam Swain. And they had seen all of this. And actually, they'd even noted how the new lava land that had been created sort of formed a sort of lagoon, which would be quite useful as a sort of small harbour. So if anything... apart from Dennis Green's house, it might be an improvement what has happened because of this volcano. Wow. So they organise a meeting at their chapel, and a guy from the Royal Society tries to sort of say, no, you can't go back, even though it does seem fine. He says this volcano is very unpredictable. He explained it thus: it's like a woman, you'll never know what she'll do next.
I have to remember that it's 1961.
Exactly.
But also, I'm going to take it as a compliment. We're unpredictable and exciting. Yeah.
And you occasionally create useful harbours.
Or major destruction of men's houses.
Yeah, exactly. Across us. CC Dennis. But all these people just weren't convinced. And this is how this Norwegian who visited them at Colshot described it in his writings about it, Peter Munch. He said, I'd never known the Tristan Islanders to agree on anything except to be free and disagree. For over a century, by their own choice, they'd been living in a community where each man was at liberty to do as he pleased, where everybody was his own master and nobody's servant. There had been a constant frustration to missionaries who tried to get a community project started. It took 70 years of pleading to get them together to build a church. But in Colshot, in the UK, instead of every man trying to ding his own independent place in this strange, noisy world, each going his own way as he had been wont to do all his life, this bunch of rugged individualists were in the process of changing into a solid, unified group, unanimously bent on one thing: to get back to Tristan da Cunha.
That is a beautiful bit of writing. Wow. That's amazing. And so, I love the idea of them as these rugged individualists, but interesting that they even bothered to write a church, make a church, sorry. I wonder if they were even religious. It sounds like they were sort of, I don't know, outside of religion and state and kind of living a different society.
Yeah. But it took 4 priests on Tristan da Cunha to get them to build a church. So they're sort of quite resistant, I guess you could say. They held a referendum. This was 2 years into them being in the UK. And almost unanimously, they decided they were all going to return. A couple of people stayed behind because they had since met partners, and so they had, marriages that they wanted to pursue in the UK. But in 1963, the first of two groups returning all of the residents to Tristan da Cunha began. The New York Times reported in March 1963, the quote, first of two returning groups trudged aboard the Royal Mail liner Amazon for the 3-week voyage return. The islanders, who had never seen sidewalks, trees, automobiles, or television when they arrived, returned with transistor radios and record players, but not many. Their 7 tons of luggage included potato seeds, small trees, and other provisions. This was the first party of 51. 198 of them sailed later that year, and the community has been back on Tristan da Cunha ever since.
Okay, wait. There's still, that same population still lives there, and it's still, one can go visit there?
Absolutely you can, yeah. Although I was talking to someone the other day who was quite into travelling to all these islands, and obviously it is an almighty faff to get there. You have to hitch board a ship, and a bit like Pitcairn, these places that are volcanic, they're very deep waters around them, so you can't necessarily anchor. It's quite hard to get off ships. So he had travelled on this ship for days and days and days from Cape Town. They got to Tristan da Cunha. Oh, the weather's too bad to let you get off. Continue on to South America. So it's really a roll 50-50. Of the dice.
Yeah. And I thought, and I know this maybe is my innocence, maybe I should live on that island. I thought you said 2 dogs they couldn't kill, and when they got back there, were those still alive?
No, those 2 dogs, Tristan and Cunha, they took with them. There weren't
every
dogs
other dog
alive when they
killed.
got there. All the other dogs got killed.
Okay.
But the sheep had massively multiplied in number.
Oh.
So that was handy when they got back.
I mean, I can't quite picture how the lagoon was formed, but that's such an amazing story. You're going to become the island expert of the world.
Well, it's people just need, as they have done with my last podcast and one upcoming soon, people get in touch with me who have investigated strange goings on these islands. This, thankfully, is quite a heartwarming story, and it is nothing to do with communities systematically abusing children or rogue surgeons maiming good chunks of populations.
It's true. And I would say, actually, now my sociologist, anthropologist hat is on, and I just love to know what they're like as people. And when you were saying they're not really bringing radios back, they were bringing trees, and it just sounds so utopic. And as a former pretty socialist thinking person, I'm like, maybe they got something right about being in isolation.
Maybe should move there. But would you want to live on an island of just sort of 200? Well, it's down to about 220 people now. Like lots of these places, they've got issues with people moving off and not necessarily wanting to stay and settle there. But would you be tempted?
Brain drain. Well, they could always do the thing that some small villages are doing in Europe and saying, you get a free house, you'll get a free whatever, because they're, so expensive to live as a young person now. But the truth is, I think it's probably a fantasy in that, like, I get upset if I'm not near a major city for more than 2 weeks, honestly. But in theory, it sounds really nice.
And actually, I guess sort of thanks Elon Musk. Lots of them have good internet now because of Starlink. Lots of these places are sort of connected and can sort of engage with the world in a way that they couldn't before. No one was laying a dial-up cable, thousands of kilometers through the South Atlantic to places like this, but now they're connected.
I hope someone's doing an anthropological study of what that's like, because I've heard even in the Amazon, where there are quite traditional living people, they've been using Starlink, and it's like, what would that be like?
And, what does that do to you?
Yeah. Imagine getting on Twitter when you've had nothing but sort of community thinking, and now it's just horrid.
Like back in the 60s, you come to the UK and it's like, oh my God, like cars, ice cream, 2026, you log onto the internet and it's like, oh no.
Horrible sort of people.
Hardcore pornography and war and just like, oh no.
So this is the amuse-bouche, which I will warn listeners is not as heartwarming as Luke's main story. So we sort of flipped our format slightly here. But
are any dogs shot?
No. So there's that.
Good.
On 19th of December 2022, this takes place in Northern Ireland, and a 32-year-old called Natalie McNally was found murdered in her home. Tragically, she was 15 weeks pregnant, and the attack on her was very violent. It implied it was someone who was close to her. It was personal. There was no signs of forced entry, which really raises a question like, who had she kind of let into her house, or who had access to that house? So the person who'd made the call about the discovery was her boyfriend, Stephen McCullough. And, as we know as true crime observers, people are always looking to the boyfriend. But immediately it became apparent that he had an alibi, which I will get to. But I just wanted to play, Luke, a little bit of that 911 call. Wow, not 911, of that 999
you
call.
Traitor, you have been away from these shores so long.
I know, I wouldn't even know how to call the police.
No.
This 999 call, which you can hear Stephen is sounding like he's in severe distress, having discovered his girlfriend killed.
Service, is the patient breathing?
Sorry?
Is the patient breathing?
No! She's cold!
Okay. Listen, what's the address of the emergency, please? What's the address?
She's cold!
Okay. Listen to me. I'm going to help you, okay? You stay on the line with me.
He sounds distraught.
Absolutely distraught. And, you know, those kind of calls are often played to juries. And, you know, there's been other instances where people wrongfully accused, like, don't sound upset enough. And, you know, there's only so much I think you can really extrapolate from that.
Yeah.
However, one can't help but hear like major distress in his voice. Police do actually arrest him at the scene of the crime. He says he has an alibi, but until they can check it out, they do arrest him as kind of the person who found her, you know, the person who had access to the house, and she's found brutally killed. However, he's released because he appears to have an alibi. Now, what was that alibi? He says that the night before, when the killing took place, he'd been playing Grand Theft Auto on a live stream. He says, like, here's the link, it's timestamped, it's live, and it was all night. So seems pretty case closed. So the police start looking, you know, into their relationship, and the couple had only met in the August before in 2022. They'd met on Bumble, as many of us meet our partners meet. And, you know, she very quickly again, by the November, she tells her family and she tells Stephen that she is pregnant. So she's really excited about it. Lots of people say they were a very happy couple. So again, no kind of immediate major red flags there. But investigators start to take a closer look at the live stream, and they're like, okay, the timing seems to match, but there's a few things that are a little bit odd. For one thing, he turned off the kind of live chat function. He said that he was having technical difficulties. So he wasn't able to engage in a live chat function with them, which you know, normally you would. Yeah. And they also start to look at the CCTV cameras, and they notice this figure that they believe is the killer, and they trace it back to, you know, where he walked to, essentially. Yes. And it does seem to lead back to Stephen's home. So you sort of see this dark figure leaving Stephen's home exactly at the time of the live stream, entering her home at the time of death, which they believe was 8:30 to 9:20, and then kind of returning home. No one hears from her for 24 hours, and then Stephen alleges he makes the discovery the next day when he goes to check on her. When the kind of technical forensics get into it, they discover that the live stream was not in fact live, that he had faked the live event by pre-recording a video, promoting it at 6 o'clock that night and saying, I'm going to be on the live stream, join if you can. Then he played this video function, and then when he got home after the killing, he deleted that original file, and he even uploaded a further video to make it look like he'd been there all night. He also exchanged texts from his home to his girlfriend and to others to again try and place him back at the scene. So this is a very planned strategic attack, and
very planned,
actually a kind of very clever alibi had it worked. But the other thing that the court would hear, which I found particularly chilling, was that within that live stream, which was obviously analyzed quite a lot, there'd been these kind of Easter eggs that McCullough had laid in to be even more sick and twisted. So, for example, a James Bond No Time to Die advert just kind of appears randomly at one point. And they'd also honed in on the fact that the game itself, being Grand Theft Auto, was the mission was titled Waste the Wife. And there was a number of like sort of slightly odd comments he was making during that live stream. He's kind of wearing a Christmas Santa hat. Again, he would have had to pre-record that tape in the days before in the plan. So the police started to build a case. Okay, so he builds his fake alibi as a live streamer. He even texts his girlfriend, I'm going to be streaming tonight. She said, oh, try and watch some of it. You know, he really placed all of those cards. And they looked again then for a motive. Now, they believe that he'd become enraged when she had been texting with an ex on WhatsApp, and that was his motivation. In court, well, on the night of the killing, he would try and hint to police that he believed an ex-boyfriend was involved, so he's trying to throw himself off the scent. But what's even more distressing...
And throw the other guy under the bus.
Exactly. What's even more distressing is in the weeks after, he remained very close to the family because the police were so off the scent. He was, turning up at the funeral. He had a private session with her at the wake. He's like asking people for justice, really pretending that he's a grieving partner when he's the one who killed her. But thank goodness for the forensics teams that's able to identify his alibi was not as it seemed. So in March of this year, the trial unfolded and he was eventually convicted. The court described the killing as premeditated and carried out with calculation planning, and he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 31 years, which is one of the longest sentences handed down in Northern Ireland.
Wow.
And, what's been really disturbing, and lots of people have kind of been writing about online, is that many of the people who were observing that live stream now have to realize that they were sort of not watching a real person, this person they thought they were engaging with, but he was actually out kind of in a double act.
Yeah, you'd sort of feel weirdly complicit, wouldn't you?
Yeah,
exactly. You engaging with it would sort of help improve the lie. Awful.
Sure. And it kind of struck me that we live in this world where people have to commit crimes with a sort of digital footprint. Your phone is going to be one of the first things. CCTV and ring door cameras make it pretty hard to exit your house, even on foot as he was. He did take a bus as well, but you can be paying in cash, you can be doing other things. Very hard not to be traced. So the digital world can be part of the false narrative you're trying to construct, but will also be very hard to do.
Because you can't do, I was reading something the other day about somebody who was suspected about something in a case, and when they were picked up by police, I think arriving at an airport, they said they didn't have a phone on them. And it's like, what? In what world do you as an adult not have a phone on you? So we're now in the world where it's not just a good enough thing to say, I don't have a phone, no, you can't track me on it, but you've got to sort of lay an alibi digitally as well, because it would be so fishy not to have a phone or to not be over a number of days spending on a debit or credit card or something like that.
Exactly. And, I've seen a number of cases where people have turned their phone into airplane mode and said like, oh, well, I was at home and I turned it off. And again,
weird.
Who's doing that? It's odd behavior, which I'm sorry if that is someone who you like to turn off your phone at night, but very suspicious.
I turn my phone off at night, like completely off. Yeah.
Oh, you've got to change that.
Oh, no.
No, I'm kidding. But I think it's just really interesting that for someone who was so strategic that he thought he could outsmart the police. I mean, I think it would be fairly obvious that you can upload fake live streams. I know I'm certainly been made aware of that sometimes it appears they're on live TikToks, but they're not. And I guess he just suspected that the police would be fairly lazy and cross him out once they thought he was live streaming.
He thought wrong.
And he will spend the rest of his life in prison.
Awful story. Well, thank you for that. And thank you for you listening. If you'd like to get in touch with us at any point, maybe you've got a story from your neck of the woods which you think, oh, this would make a good amuse-bouche, or maybe like a whole episode or something, strangely at alwaystruecrime.com is how to get in touch with us. And if you enjoy these episodes, send it to somebody, send it in a WhatsApp, screen grab it to them and say, wow, this is the best thing I've ever listened to. You should listen as well, so we can just talk about it together. All of that, please. 5-star reviews. We read all of them. We cry when they're not nice. So please get in touch, spread the word, and join us next week for more Strangely. Bye-bye. Bye.